Good evening to people who are joining us and making the late night shift here in Ottawa and in Canada. And good morning to those of our friends who are joining us, including some of our speakers from the Indo-Pacific region. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller. I am director of the Indo-Pacific program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And it's my great pleasure to convene this discussion with a stable of our experts and those in our network on the most recently released Indo-Pacific Strategy from Canada. So now we're just shy of 2 weeks after Canada has published its 26-page report on the Indo-Pacific. I think many of our viewers and many of our network that are going to be joining today have been eagerly anticipating, and in some ways we've been a little bit impatient over the years, hoping that this strategy would come sooner. But we do have this in time for Christmas. And it's time for us in this session to sort of unpack what's inside this strategy. Does it meet Canada's interests in this region? And how is it being received by a lot of our key allies and partners in this region? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to us, we have a really large cast tonight, but hopefully we'll have a very diverse discussion. So if we can bring up our experts that are joining us tonight. We have with us, and apologies to all, it's great to see you all. Apologies that I'm going to be very, very quick on your bios so that we can get straight to the discussion. But we have Margaret McQuaig-Johnston, who is a senior fellow from the University of Ottawa, great friend of the Institute, and has had a long distinguished career in the Canadian public service. We also have, of course, Charles Burton, who is MLI's senior fellow, has spent a lifetime focused on this part of the world and especially Chinese security issues. Charles, it's great to have you. We also have our senior advisor, Elliot Tepper, who is also a professor at Carleton University. And Elliot similarly has spent a lifetime focusing on Asia, both from a perspective of US foreign policy, but also from his perch here in Ottawa. Elliot, a real pleasure to have you as well. Spanning over to the West Coast in Victoria, we have our senior fellow, Jeff Kucharski. Jeff also has significant experience in this part of the world and has a range of different areas of expertise, including energy security, Japan-Canada relations, etc. So Jeff, thanks so much for joining us from Victoria. Next, we have our newest member, one of our new visiting fellow from Japan, Ms. Kyoko Kuwahara, who is a fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs and is now joining us at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Kyoko focuses on a range of different issues, including disinformation and public diplomacy. And I think, with this strategy, one of the most important things, in my view, is public diplomacy. So we really are looking forward to your wisdom, Kyoko. Thanks for joining. Next, we have another one of our senior fellows, Scott Simon, who is a professor at the University of Ottawa and an expert on Taiwan, Japan, and Canada's engagement in the Indo-Pacific as well. Scott, always a pleasure to have you on. Almost last, second to last, we have, but definitely not least, my friend Jim Boutillier, again joining us from the West Coast, a long distinguished career as a senior advisor to the Canadian Forces in the Maritime Pacific, and now a distinguished fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Jim, it's a real pleasure to have you. And then last, but certainly not least, and the furthest away, joining us all the way from Tokyo, is our senior fellow, Stephen Nagy, who has too many affiliations for me to get out in this introduction, but nonetheless, he is an expert on all things Indo-Pacific, China-Japan relations, and also the interplay with Canada's role in this region. Stephen, a real pleasure to have you on the stage as well. So if we can get started, I want to get right into the discussion. First, I'm going to turn to you, Margaret. As I mentioned a little bit in your bio, obviously you've had a long experience in the Canadian government, serving in several senior executive roles. I think the two of us and many here in Ottawa have been eagerly anticipating this strategy. I know you've had a lot of discussions with those in government and those outside over the past few years as this develops. I'm interested in your sort of initial take. And before you do that, I'm abusing the privilege of the moderator to give you one of my initial takes. There's a lot of things, details in the strategy that need to be sussed out. I think there's a lot of incomplete elements that we need to look at. That being said, if we were to think 5 years ago that we would see a strategy that looked like this, I think that fundamentally would not be the case. So if we see the dramatic change in the fact that from where we were 5 years ago to where we are now, from my view, there is a significant movement. It doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be much more movement, but I think that is notable. But I do want to turn to you first for your sort of perspective on, number one, where we came from, but where we are now with this new Indo-Pacific strategy. So Margaret, please.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'm really pleased to be here to talk about the strategy. I think it's a really important piece of government policy. And I share your view that we wouldn't have the same document 3-4 years ago. So I want to talk a little bit about how we got here. My own research is in China's innovation system and also the problems that Canadian technology companies have had in China. And so in 2019, when Global Affairs Canada asked my advice on our China crisis with the Michaels and so on, there were a number of things I recommended, but one was that we have an Indo-Pacific strategy so that our companies could be assisted to reduce their risk in China. And Minister Champagne accepted the proposal and work started on it in early November 2019. So it's been more than 3 years in development. There have been numerous delays. What I had hoped we would get was something that was comprehensive and fully funded. And we saw a range of things over the last while. In April of 22, so in the spring, Jolie went to Asia. She went to Vietnam and Indonesia. And the day after she was in Vietnam, Wang Yi called his Vietnamese counterpart and said that he shouldn't be talking to anybody about Indo-Pacific strategies, that they were divisive in the region. It was gang up on China, and if he knew what was good for him, he wouldn't entertain any such discussions. And I no doubt the Canadian embassy or the Canadian government has had blowback like that from the Chinese embassy from time to time over the last 3 years, because they often say those kinds of things publicly. So she had planned to table the strategy in the spring. That didn't happen. We were told it was put off indefinitely with no explanation. Over the period of the 3 years, it had gone from being a detailed document to being a thin document, being very high level. Maybe it would have no mention of China at all. For a period, there was no new money, so departments had to bring their own resources and cut other things to make room for an Indo-Pacific strategy. Maybe it would just be some themes in a few ministerial speeches. And I've been pressing all along for comprehensive and fully funded. So 3 years of delays. Canadian ministers during this time were seeing more and more risks associated with China. And we're starting to make decisions that were welcome by me and others on the panel. Huawei, for example, it was 3.5 years it took them to make that decision, but they landed in the right place finally. And so, when we looked at the Indo-Pacific strategy that came out, it was comprehensive, it was fully funded, it took China on head on, calling it aggressive and coercive, and it brought in targeted initiatives. And that was the thing I wasn't expecting. Really targeted initiatives, big money associated with each one. Some have said it should be more, but this is, Minister Jolie has called it a down payment on the relationships. And it's a 10-year plan. It's costed for 5 years for some initiatives, 3 years for the big one, 750 million for infrastructure. And so I guess in conclusion, I was number one, surprised. I was number two, really pleased. And number three, I was really relieved, because you have one chance to do an Indo-Pacific strategy, and they got it right. And that's why I've been calling it visionary and a model for other countries, because for those countries that don't have it, have one yet, I think we have now set a new bar. So I'm super pleased with it. We can get into details. I'm looking forward to doing that, but that's my take on it.
Well, thanks very much, Margaret. You know, for your viewpoint and sort of your context of where this came from. You know, I think there's a couple elements there that are interesting that you mentioned. The funding thing as well. I think you're right in that sense, that it's any strategy that has money attached to it is a good thing. I think there's a lot of questions, frankly, still that need to be asked about the funding. But the fact that there is funding at all in this environment is one thing to mention. Often, you know, and again, I don't want to say that there aren't some very, very strong parts of the strategy that surprised me as well. But I did get that sense, you know, if I make the analogy to a Christmas present, that when you open it, you're very excited and you're like, yeah, mom and dad or Santa, I got what I wanted. And then all of a sudden, some of the parts of it seem to be sort of falling off, or you're not quite sure that the batteries are right, or they're not in properly. I'm a bit worried about some elements. It doesn't mean that you can't get those right parts in, but I think that we need to be focused too on the framework itself. I think has some really good elements, but making sure all those parts come into place. And on that point, maybe I want to move over to Charles Burton and get your take. And specifically, I want to dovetail onto the focus on China, because I know, Charles, this is something you focus on a lot. You've you know, commented quite a bit on the media before and after this strategy. For my count, and maybe this was a miscount, but I think China was listed 51 times in this document. I think Margaret's right that perhaps 3 or 5 years ago, maybe there would have been 0 mentions, and it wouldn't have even been included in a regional strategy. That being said, I think the timeline is interesting. I think, yes, it's positive that we've mentioned China, but at least from my view, the urgency that we've dealt with this, and this can be thought on a whole host of issues. Frankly, we are very, very late on this. Charles, I want to get your sort of viewpoint on the strategy, how you think it deals with China, whether you think it's robust enough, and what are the good things, what are the bad things? You know, Charles, please.
Well, you know, I think that we have to bear in mind that the American Secretary of State was in Ottawa in October, and at that time we announced that we would have a strategic dialogue with the United States on Indo-Pacific. And so I think that suggests that the Americans felt that they had some dialoguing to do with us on this topic. And at the same time, we then asked if the Americans would consider us letting us into the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, a 14-country alliance from which Canada was very markedly excluded. So I do think that Canada's previous policy of, you know, talking a good line on China to some extent, but not doing anything that would make the Chinese authorities discontented with Canada as an ally is no longer washing with Washington. And I think that, you know, like the threat that they made when Canada was considering putting in the Huawei 5G, that if we don't start to get into alliance with our like-minded allies, the United States, Australia, UK, and other countries like Japan and South Korea, that this could threaten the integrity of the Five Eyes, and maybe it would turn into a Three Eyes of Australia, UK, US. So, you know, I do think that there's a lot of motivation from that, and statements made by Minister Champagne talking about the need for decoupling, and Minister Freeland talking about the need for friendshoring, were both made in the United States. So, one could see this policy as reactive to U.S. pressure, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people on the left and supporters of China, well, certainly supporters of China, who see Canada, as the Chinese media has put it, as a dog's leg of goatway of the United States. But there are clearly very sound Canadian reasons why we should be better addressing the challenge of China's malign activities inside Canada and China's overall global agenda in the third world and in the Indo-Pacific. And so, I think that the policy is certainly welcome. It is a weak policy. It's a policy, really, not a strategy. It's mostly full of aspirational statements, not about actual action that our government plans to take on any of the outstanding issues beyond an additional freighter into the Indo-Pacific, but nothing specific about things that wouldn't cost anything, like a Foreign Agents Registry Act, like a strong statement on support of Taiwan, like some determination to declare persona non grata Chinese diplomats who are coordinating harassment and interference activities inside Canada, or coordinating the large program of espionage against dual-use military technologies out of our universities and other ways. I mean, there's nothing there that says we're actually going to do anything, but there is some indication that we're going to beef up our China expertise in the government, and that we will, try and get together with like-minded allies to come up with a common approach to China. And I think that's all good. So I see the policy as a promising starting point. I think that ultimately we'll end up doing better than the strategy currently indicates, because there's a general trend going on in the world for the liberal West to try and defend the rules-based international order against China's very explicit policy to undermine it and replace it with what China calls the community of the common destiny of mankind, and reorient the global economy towards China through the Belt and Road Initiative. So, I'm glad to see it. It's clearly, we're still schizophrenic about China. There's no question that the lack of mention of China earlier indicates that there's still a lot of Canadian interest very much beholden to China. But I think that the policy being there does offer Canada an opportunity to really do a major rethink of how we interact with China, both in terms of our domestic policies and internationally.
Thanks a lot, Charles. I think that plays and feeds well off Margaret's initial comments, and leads me well into I want to go to Stephen now, and I know that Stephen has to go soon. But before I do that, a couple comments that will lead into hopefully what Stephen's thoughts on this. Your point on the United States is interesting, and I think Margaret was alluding to this also in her initial comments as well. I mean, for me, it's less responding to U.S. pressure and more responding to reality. I've consistently been saying this in the sense that, look on a map where we are. We're very much a North American nation. It doesn't mean that we have to mimic things identically to the United States in foreign policy terms, but it is very much a national security and economic reality for Canada. We are not the Netherlands. We are not Germany. We are friends with the Netherlands and we are friends with Germany, but our outlook is very different from others in the region. Not to mention the fact that we have a massive Pacific coastline, which Jim and Jeff are there on that side as well right now. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind. But that's a good segue to Stephen, because we've talked a lot about the internal machinations within Canada, some of the public perceptions that led to that. I'm interested as well now, looking at how the region has been viewing Canada. Number one, how's it viewed the strategy? But Stephen, you've been having discussions, not just there in Japan, but you travel throughout the region extensively in ASEAN, in Taiwan, et cetera. The perceptions of Canada before this strategy and the perceptions perhaps after this strategy. I'd be interested in you sort of shedding some light on, what sort of Canada does the region want? It might be different in different places. What sort of Canada does the region expect? And did this strategy, in your mind, sort of meet some of those expectations?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that I'll use 3 key words to try and convey my thoughts. The first is relatable. The second is resources. And then third is this idea of reliability. And in terms of relatable aspects of Canada's foreign policy within the region and coming off the Canadian Indo-Pacific Strategy, I think there's some things to like, some things that the countries within the region really don't get. And then other aspects, I think that they may disagree with. So the position of China within the Indo-Pacific Strategy, I think, came as a surprise. Many countries within the region have seen and understand Japan as Canada rather schizophrenic in terms of its China policy. And the fact that China played such a central role in thinking about the Canadian Indo-Pacific Strategy is a real plus. I think that they also liked the highlighting of important partners within the region. That's Japan, South Korea, Australia, ASEAN. I think these are well taken, and it's a relief that China is part of the region, not the region. And I think that the strategy really put that into focus. That being said, I think that there's a few initiatives or a few thoughts within the strategy that really aren't relatable for the region. And frankly, I think it's a lot of the progressive issues that were being promulgated within the strategy. Quite frankly, most of the countries within these regions, before the policy was released and after the policy was released, don't share these Canadian values. And as a result, they see this not as a good use of resources within the region. I think they also thought that there probably could have been more focus on some of the region's challenges. And the challenges aren't just associated with China's rise. I think North Korea and weapons proliferation is very serious. The challenges on the Himalayan plateau is very serious. These are areas that I think could have been placed more central within the strategy. In terms of resources, this is a challenge for Canadian credibility. And Margaret mentioned this, a 10-year plan of $2.3 billion really isn't much when we think about the $3.4 billion that the Canadian government has put towards the Ukraine since February 24, 2022. This is a figure that came from the Prime Minister's office. So, and the Prime Minister's office continues to want to invest more in the Ukraine. So comparing the resources that have been invested in terms of the Indo-Pacific versus Ukraine, I think it raises eyebrows within the region of how sustainable and meaningful the Canadian footprint will be without a much larger set of resources being deployed in the region. Reliability, and this is goes to the very last point. How do these countries see Canada within the region, and does the Canadian Indo-Pacific Strategy change that? Well, I think what I hear in the region over and over is we have challenges in terms of credibility. The walkout at Da Nang after the TPP negotiations still is a hangover, and has created reliability challenges for Canada and Canadian diplomats within the region. I guess the optimistic views about a progressive FTA with China, the bringing of terrorists or separatists to India on an official visit of the Prime Minister, these all really continue to create credibility challenges as we think about Canadian engagement within the region. And lastly, I think, I think it would raises questions in terms of the Asia-Pacific Foundation's central position within the Indo-Pacific Strategy, considering that it has written papers and it's advocated for against this idea of like-minded countries supporting a rules-based order within the region. And I think that placing this organization front and center in the delivery and implementation of our Indo-Pacific Strategy really creates credibility challenges when that institution doesn't believe in the fundamental rule-based order and like-minded approach to dealing with the region that really has been the cornerstone to post-World War II Canadian peace and prosperity. So again, I think relatability, reliability, and resources are really key ways to understand how the region sees Canada after the Indo-Pacific strategy has been released.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Really interesting points. As always, learn a lot from your insights. I did want to hinge on this. I mean, a lot of this to me comes down to communication and the way that diplomacy is conducted, public diplomacy. And Kyoko, eventually I do want to go to you on this point. But your point is well taken. In order, money is important, of course, resources are important, but an argument I often make is that you could come with a plane full of 500 million or 5 billion, and it wouldn't matter if the money wasn't spent wisely and wasn't spent with an empathetic ear to your partners on the ground. So that is also, frankly, there are parts of the strategy that are funded, and I'll give a few examples, like the Ocean Management Fund. I think it does hit a niche where we can actually provide some value. I think many of our partners, especially in the ASEAN region, could benefit from that. But there might be others that I think sound really good to 40 or 50 people in Ottawa, but might not sound good to countries in the region. So I think we need to make sure that any conversation balances our interests as a country and where we want to go as a government, side by side with what the region actually wants of Canada. I think we really need to have those discussions of not just what we want to do, but what the region wants and expects for us to do. And Kyoko, before I go to you on this, I think one point on this is I think the Prime Minister's trip to Southeast Asia. I think there were some positive things about that. I'm all supportive of more senior leaders and officials and ministers spending more time in Asia. I think that's been one of the fair criticisms for several years, is that we don't show up often enough. But the problem is not just showing up and showing up often, but it's what you say and how you say it. And I think that we've had a bit of a challenge in our communication approach, effectively sort of listing what we can offer rather than empathetically understanding the situation. And I feel, talking to some of my friends and colleagues in Southeast Asia since the strategy has been released, that there is a bit of feeling of transactionalism after the trip. I think maybe Jim, you had mentioned this in a previous webinar, this sort of valedictory sort of approach where, a mission accomplished, we're here, we're back, we're ready to engage. Whereas I think the region said, that's great, we're happy, we like Canada, but please understand and listen to our challenges. So all of that being said, I'd like to go to you, Kyoko, because I know that you have an expertise in public diplomacy, also on the disinformation side as well, which was an interesting part that was referenced in this strategy. I'm interested, number one, Japan, I think, is one of the intellectual parents of the Indo-Pacific. We talked about the US approach, but when we think about countries that have been thinking about the Indo-Pacific region for a long time, I think of Japan, of course, first and foremost, as one of the proponents. So I'm interested in your view, number one, on the public diplomacy side, but also, what are the initial reactions in Japan as one of our key partners to this strategy? Is this something that has been welcomed from the Japanese perspective? What areas would they like to push it more? Kyoko, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to discuss Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy from Japan's security perspective, also Japan's public diplomacy point of view. For Japan, Canada's strategy is long awaited, of course, and a welcome development. And I regard the strategy as one of the most important and meaningful public diplomacy from Canada to Japan, which Japan needs to correctly understand or catch the message from Canada. The strategy details the importance of Japan as the only G7 partner countries in the Indo-Pacific region and the second largest economy among the CPTPP partners. Actually, Japan was mentioned 25 times in the strategy, more than the number of mentions of any other partners in the region. However, the strategy only described cooperation with Japan in the area that has already discussed between two countries. For instance, implementation of the 6 shared priorities as two countries agreed in 2021, including rule of law, security, global health, energy, trade, and climate, as well as negotiation of general security of information agreement. So we should flexibly see cooperation that goes beyond these areas outlined in the strategy, I think. So Japan began to build capabilities that will form the basis, or I would say cornerstones, for future cooperation among Japan and Canada. For instance, securing economic security. For instance, this also defense budget increase, also putting greater emphasis on new security domains such as cyberspace and cognitive domain, including disinformation campaigns developed by foreign countries, and security clearance issues. Japan should welcome, or we are all welcoming Canada's strategy, but Japan should more welcome Canada's development Canada's involvement in the Indo-Pacific region, and actively pursue deeper cooperation and collaboration between two countries. Canada could be the most natural partner for Japan. This strategic cooperation between two countries should also be developed for the international society to address any challenges to the international order or peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region.
Well, thanks very much, Kyoko. That's really interesting, and makes me think on many different elements. But I'd like to move to Jeff on this next point. I agree. I mean, the Japan-Canada relationship baffles me in many senses. I feel like it is an irritant-free relationship for the most part, a good relationship. We see each other in so many multilateral settings, but I still think it lacks that inspiration and that ability to take it to the next level. And rather than just looking at the bilateral channel and the multilateral channels, I think seeing Japan as a hub to the Indo-Pacific. I mean, frankly, there are a few different partners we work with that are important in that region, of course, South Korea being others, but I really see Japan as that sort of force multiplier in this region that we could work with in third parties and in other areas, whether that's in Southeast Asia, whether that's potentially in places like Mongolia or elsewhere. I think there's a lot of untapped opportunities, and I'm really hoping the way that this strategy is viewed is not just how do we do something with Japan, how do we do something with India, how do we do something with South Korea, but more how do we do something regionally with many of these partners, which I think is maybe unnatural to Canadian foreign policy because we normally do think in those baskets of multilateral, bilateral, but I think we're going to have to start thinking more creatively. But I do want to turn to Jeff because, one of the key elements, I think, of the Japan relationship, but not limited to Japan, I think, is on energy security. I think in the 6-point action plan that we have in the Indo-Pacific, energy security is listed as one. Although conspicuously, there's number one, no mention of the free and open Indo-Pacific, which we have mentioned in official documents with Japan, including by our Prime Minister. There's no mention in this document of that, and there's also no mention of our single largest investment project, which will impact the Indo-Pacific, which is LNG Canada, amongst other energy security equities that we'll have in this part of the world. So I wanted to get your take on that, but also I know you have other thoughts on this strategy. And Jeff, I welcome your ideas.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I'm happy to share my ideas. I guess I want to say a couple of positive things first. I do think that this is probably the most comprehensive and detailed strategy document I've seen on the region in at least 20 years, probably a lot more than that even. I mean, we've been looking forward to something like this for some time. So I think that's good. And, but having said that, it has gaps. I think it should be considered a work in progress. It's good the strategy is aligned with our most important partner in the Indo-Pacific, which is the United States and Japan in particular. And I think the strategy recognizes a number of emerging and intensifying threats that we're facing in the world today, particularly from autocracies like China, but other threats too, including climate change and other threats to the rules-based order. So in terms of a vision and direction-setting document, I think it's a good start. But, you know, as they say, there are gaps. And, you know, for me, anyway, a person who pays a lot of attention to energy, I think it was very surprising to me that the energy crisis that we're in the midst of today, and what Canada can do to address this, especially with our partners and allies in the region, particularly Japan, but also South Korea and others, is missing. You know, the energy crisis is not a passing phenomenon. This is not a short-term thing that's going to go away quickly. It's going to be with us for some years. And surprisingly, as you said, the term energy security doesn't appear anywhere in the Indo-Pacific Strategy except in a passing reference to Japan, because that's in a separate document. Despite this energy security being one of the most important and urgent policy issues the world and this region faces today. And it's actually an issue that Canada can actually make a very positive contribution towards. So that was surprising. And as you said, there's no mention of some of the major projects in Canada that are within a couple of years probably of completion, that being particularly the LNG Canada project here on the West Coast that will be world scale, and it will be able to export a considerable quantity of LNG to countries that are highly reliant on LNG in Asia, particularly Japan and South Korea, but others as well. And then the other one is the Trans Mountain Pipeline project, which also will be completed in the next year or two, and it will be able to export crude oil into the region on a very substantial basis. So these are two very big projects that have tremendous benefits for Canada in terms of exports, but impact on our GDP and jobs, and a lot of benefits accruing to the country, in particular Western Canada. You know, I think that's a gap. I think it needs to be addressed. I don't think we should be embarrassed by the fact that fossil fuels will still be needed in the next few decades as we continue the transition to clean energy. The International Energy Agency, in all its scenarios, confirms that there will be demand for some fossil fuels, even in 2050 and even under a net zero scenario. So Canada is in a good position because, you know, we're one of the few countries that has large scale reserves of these resources that aren't under the control of authoritarian regimes as they are in places like Russia and even in the Middle East. So we, in fact, could be relied on much more going forward for these kinds of products. So it's important for countries in the North Pacific in particular who still rely on imports of oil and gas for their energy security. They don't have domestic sources. They are working hard to increase renewables and clean energy, as we are too. But this transition means it's just that, it's a transition. And we need to recognize that energy security is an extremely important top of mind policy issue for these countries. And we need to work closely with them to help give them that assurance. So that would be my major comment on gaps. I have some others as well, but maybe I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And I mean, I really, you know, profound points there. I mean, a couple of things before moving to Elliot, which I'll go to next. You know, first, I think it's the importance of number one, recognizing that not just the crisis of today, but ideally the crisis of tomorrow. We can't forecast these things. We hope that there is no crisis tomorrow. But when you think on energy terms, obviously everything our European friends are going through right now, I often say that this would be a cakewalk compared to a real heated kinetic conflict in the Indo-Pacific. And often you just need to show people the maps and the idea of the supply chains of energy that go to the big, especially the Northeast Asian economies like Japan and South Korea. 80 to 90% of their energy imports coming from the Gulf. Traversing through the South China Sea, traversing through the Strait of Malacca, through a lot of very challenging choke points. Does that seem like a reliable energy source and a reliable, secure supply chain? I don't think it does. So I agree that we need to be thinking of, when we're thinking of the problems in the next 10 to 15 years, we hope this is not one, but this is one that we need to keep attention to. In addition to the fact that the Gulf itself, maybe there's so many things going on that no one has the attention span to look at stability there. But I mean, talk about another potential nightmare if something were to happen in security terms in the Gulf, and that cuts off that energy security supply chain. So I think Canada needs to be thinking much more seriously about this. Elliot, I did want to pivot to you now to get your thoughts on this. And one thing that Jeff mentioned in the first time I've heard it tonight is Russia. And you can, I'm sure you have thoughts more broadly on the strategy, but Russia was a country that got zero mentions in the Indo-Pacific strategy, which to me and to my view was a mistake. Again, I think Russia, of course, has its hands full through its own volition and its own mistakes through its illegal war in Ukraine. But it still is a spoiler in the Indo-Pacific. I do see Russia-China coordination continuing and deepening over the past few years. So I'd be interested, number one, in your take on Russia. Should it have been mentioned in the strategy? Is that something that Canada should be thinking more deeply about, especially on the Russia-China side? But also just more generally, your thoughts on the strategy. You've studied this part of the world for so many years. Similar to the questions I asked others, do you think this really meets the expectations that those in the region have on Canada?
Well, two parts to your question then. The question of Russia, I think perhaps we're overlooking, among other things, there's a China dimension here. There's a great deal of talk about national rejuvenation, and China has suffered from unequal treaties. Well, some of those unequal treaties deal with what today is Russian Asia. So take a look at Amur and the possibility that Russia is now going to be the junior partner and just a resource base for an emerging China. They like vassal states. In terms of this particular document, since it did focus primarily on two things, on China and what should Canada do in the Asia Pacific, the absence of Russia, I don't think jumped out at me in particular, but I think it is well worth keeping in mind. And remember, we have the Arctic situation. The Arctic was mentioned, and Russia's a factor there. The long view is what I would take on the Indo-Pacific strategy. I've been at this a long time, as you know. So looking back, looking forward is how I come at this. I've got a quote here from the Prime Minister. As I stand before you today, I am filled with confidence. We stand at the threshold of a new and promising Pacific era. And that was Prime Minister Brian Mulroney speaking in 1986 at the Canada-China Business Council. And it was full of optimism about where that was going to go. And the comment that Jeff made, we haven't had a strategy in a while. I've got a prop. I hope it, can you pick that up? So we've had a comprehensive action program in regard to ASEAN for a long time. And it takes me really to my main point, and I'm going to build on some of the issues I've already raised. The comprehensive action program really was a recommendation for the creation within the region of the Canada ASEAN Center, and it got created. It was set up. It was set up for 10 years, and that had two key components to it. The key components were, on the one hand, it was going to be a great policy and program accelerator, work with all the embassies and make everything there work better. And the other side of it was going to be a soft power platform. We were going to have within the region a way to broadcast Canadian culture, bring in all kinds of aspects of culture, Canadian culture, spread it around the region. So it was a soft power. It was set up. We kept it for 10 years and shut it down. Now we have what I think is correctly, as Margaret put it, a really visionary statement. I didn't count up all the many different ways it was pointed out. We are going to establish a new, we're going to set up a new, we are going to create a new, there's going to be a special envoy. But one of the things they're going to set up is a new trade gateway. We had a gateway. We shut it down. And because that center that was set up was redefined as primarily a trade center. So the elements within this, I think, are very well thought out. And the delay in getting it out, I think, is actually a plus, because I'm not sure that even 5 months ago, I mean, we expected this in April. I think China has come into focus in a way it might not have in any earlier time period. And finally it has. And finally we are getting serious about it. Within this strategy, in all kinds of ways, Canada is bulking up in regard to dealing with the Indo-Pacific. It's spreading out in terms of dealing with the Indo-Pacific. It is going down. What I will use as my gauge is, will there be more institutional linkages? Will we be structurally integrated into the Indo-Pacific as a result of this strategy in a way that we would not have otherwise? But the comments made earlier at the opening by Jonathan, here's our concern, and it's been summarized, will we stay with it? We're supposed to be active, engaged, and as Stephen said, reliable. We're not seen as reliable. We open up things, we shut them down. This is our moment. We have now made a very broad statement. I've got areas I could talk about in it, but broadly speaking, we now have firmly once again said, yes, we are going to take this area seriously. This Indo-Pacific is important to us. We've got plans for it. We are putting resources into it. We can argue about which ones are better or worse. I look forward to James' comments about naval diplomacy, because I always enjoy those so much. And I've traveled in Asia a lot, and I've seen what that works out to be. But will the gravitational pull of the United States and changing vagaries within Canada scuttle this very promising start? This is it. This is a moment. If we don't get this one right, then we've already been shut out. We weren't part of the Quad. We're not part of AUKUS. We're not part of the emerging security architecture, IPEF. The emerging security architecture, the regional dimensions, the trade dimensions for that matter, we're just not part of them. We have to get this right. We have to follow through.
Thanks, Elliot. Fully agree with your point. I mean, I make the analogy often that the train of geopolitics and geoeconomics is the same thing in this region. I mean, it's not only has it's passed, it's well on its way. It's chugging at a fast speed. I mean, we're lucky at this point to be jumping onto the caboose, with one arm onto the train and saying, "Can you please let us on?" It's, again, that's not to say the countries in the region don't want Canada, but we are well behind, and I think that's something to keep in mind. While we congratulate ourselves on this strategy, it's again very. I know there's a lot of hard work that went into it. These things aren't easy, but at the same point, we have to keep this acknowledgement that we are very much behind on this. And I think your point of transactionalism is important too, because we've been here before. Your quote from Mulrooney, I think, is interesting. I mean, you probably could have heard that, 2 weeks ago from a different minister. Now's the time. Now is the era for the Pacific. So that leads me, and I do want to get to Jim on this, because Jim has spent a lifetime traveling through the Pacific region as well. Is this notion of getting away from the idea of the Indo-Pacific as a project. The Indo-Pacific is not a project. It's not a 5-year, investment or a 10-year investment. This is for life. This is the marriage you can't escape. Your interests are at play and will be decided by the future of how this region runs. So I think that sort of understanding, there were parts of it in the visionary part, as Margaret mentioned, the state in the policy, policy. But I'm still sort of not quite seeing that in the interactions and some of the speeches from the officials so far, where I still get that sense of transactionalism, like we're going to do this for 5 years for this amount of $1 million. We're going to do this for 5 years. The reality is no one wants to hear what you're going to do for 5 years. People want to know that you're going to be there for 50 at least. With that being said, Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you because you have sat in on so many of these discussions in the ASEAN region, in Northeast Asia, and a lot of these discussions are probably old hat for you. But I would be interested in your view on some of the points that Elliot just mentioned, but also turning to, especially on the naval side, some of the commitments coming out from this strategy, obviously defense engagement being increased, some additional funding to that. But the reality is, in defense terms, we still have capability issues. The amount of resources that we have, even with an additional frigate being deployed to the region, which is great, in the long term, can we sustain a real credible, reliable, and consistent defense engagement in this region? That's something I would be interested in kind of getting your thoughts on.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. In an earlier MLI webinar, I had the good fortune of sharing with the viewers an observation related to an Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada publication from 1984, which urged the Canadian government to be aggressive, in the best sense of the word, in engaging Asia. And that was only 38 years ago. And of course, that resonates with Elliot's comments from Mulroney in 1986. And we could probably populate the landscape between 1986 and now with a variety of other well-meaning, well-intended undertakings, none of which have really borne fruit. But let me come back to the issue that you raised, and that's with respect to sea power. The vast majority of Canadians, of course, live well away from the sea, and they don't reflect about what navies do. And of course, when navies are at work, they're out of sight, out of mind. They sail out of harbors and vanish into the vast reaches of the world's oceans. But when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, I think we have to think about the sheer enormity of the two oceans involved, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. When you go from Victoria to Yokohama, for example, or to Tokyo, that's 4,500 miles. Imagine getting in your family car and driving from Victoria to St. John's, Newfoundland at 20 miles an hour, which is about the normal speed of advance for a warship. Or to put it another way, when you go from Victoria to the Persian Gulf, that's 40 days, day and night of steaming. So what we have when we look at warships is a wonderfully flexible instrument of statecraft. They can host diplomatic receptions, and moments later they can be setting off to patrol or even to engage in war. No other instrument of statecraft has that sort of flexibility, has the latitude to visit almost every corner of the world. Almost all the great cities of the world are close to or are on the ocean shore. But when we're operating in the Pacific, the distances are truly enormous. To go from Victoria to Yokohama and then to Sydney is roughly the equivalent of traveling halfway around the world. But when the minister calls on the Navy to do more, I certainly applaud that undertaking because for the past 25 years, the Royal Canadian Navy has in fact deployed, on average, 1 to 2 frigates into the reaches of the Pacific and even into the Indian Ocean on a regular basis. But the frigates, which are really wonderful ships and the core of our surface fleet, were designed in the 70s, built in the 80s, and delivered in the 90s. So most of those ships are already 30 years old. They're coming towards the end of their operational lives. Now, the Navy has plans to extend their operational lives, but this is a serious issue in terms of long-term deployments. Secondly, it's important to remember the sort of 3-in-1 or 4-in-1 rule which applies to naval shipping.
in the sense that if you have 6 ships, you're probably only likely to have 2 ships that are actually deployed at sea. The rest are working up, or they're being repaired, and so forth. So we may be up against the stops in terms of the sheer availability. Now, of course, the minister realized that when there was a call for one of the ships operating in the Pacific Ocean to come from Halifax. And indeed, if you look at the world map, Victoria to Mumbai and Halifax to Mumbai are equal distances. So one could argue the toss that it's just as easy to send ships from one coast or the other. But these, again, are huge distances. So I applaud a greater naval presence. The Indo-Pacific is the quintessential maritime region of the world. All discussions with respect to pending contestation or hostilities relate to what will happen if there are great clashes at sea. And so it's incumbent upon us to send ships to the region to work with our partners, and we have an exceedingly close working relationship with the United States Navy. We need to build further on our relations with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, which is a sophisticated and wide-ranging navy. And the Japanese, as I think perhaps Jeff or Kyoko had suggested, Japanese are really pace setters. Since Shinzo Abe's time, what we've seen is the Japanese are leaning forward, engaging countries in the Southeast Asian region, Australia, reaching on to India. And so in many ways, they can act as Sherpas for us to rebuild our long-term relations in the region, using our Navy as only one instrument of statecraft, but an exceedingly valuable one, which can, in fact, show the flag in every sense of the word, whether it's diplomatic or whether it is in terms of trade promotion and so forth, or whether it reflects our concerns about the vitality, the continued vitality of the world's oceans. The Navy is a superb instrument which we can turn to, and we should work closely with the Japanese and, of course, longtime partners like the Australians, Singaporeans, Indians, and so forth. So I certainly applaud that element of the Indo-Pacific strategy, but I do have concerns going forward about the vitality of our ships, because they have already put in a lifetime of service on behalf of the nation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Really helpful and insightful comments. And one thing, and forgive my ignorance, for you would know this issue better, but with the resource challenges that we face, and I think as you rightly sort of scoped out the distance challenges with our limited capabilities of deploying into the Pacific, I wonder if that sparks the discussion to much more actively work with the partners. And I think that you referenced a few of them there. I mean, most naturally, obviously, our relationship with the United States. And I know none of these agreements or these these type of arrangements are easy. But for example, the United States has significant bases in the Pacific. Are there ways to work with the United States, whether they're reciprocal access agreements, ways that we can work on maintenance, for example, so that we may have some of these deals in place already, but it would seem with this issue of distance a natural way, if we want to project ourselves more in the Pacific, to be working much, much more closely in hand with Indo-PACOM in the United States. Whether they want us there is another question, but that seems one area. And secondly, some of our key partners like Japan, for example, we've seen other states where Japan is interested in getting reciprocal access agreements with. Is this something, as our defense relationship gets built up, that we start looking at that option of working closely with Japan in that sense to reduce some of these distance strains that you mentioned? You don't have to answer that now, but just something to sort of keep in mind. I do want to move over now to Scott, and thank you for your patience in waiting. Scott, I mean, there's a lot of areas that I think that would be of interest to you in this strategy, but I do want to sort of start with Taiwan. Taiwan for me was a bit of a surprise, seeing how much Taiwan was mentioned, and talking to a lot of our Taiwanese friends. I think they were generally quite pleased with this strategy. I think being mentioned 7 or 8 times. And one of the interesting things, not only was Taiwan mentioned, but I think it was mentioned not exclusively under the rubric of economy and cultural issues, which is traditionally, if the Canadian government ever wants to mention Taiwan, they will focus it in that element. But there was discussion, for example, on disinformation, in addition to the stability in the Taiwan Strait. So, Scott, I wanted to get your take on, what's your perspective on how this strategy deals with Taiwan, but I guess more importantly to the point of where do we go from here? Because I see this as a baseline. We can't go below it. We can only go above it. So where do we build with this building blocks that have been put in this strategy publicly? How do we develop that relationship with Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan, because I've been doing Taiwan studies since the 1990s. And so this has been a very important document for me. You are absolutely correct that Taiwan has appreciated the Indo-Pacific strategy very much. They're quite happy with what we've done, because this is really the first time ever that we've paid so much attention to Taiwan in such a public way. I will say to begin with that we share both values with Taiwan, and we also have some very important interests, as well as having a close relationship with Taiwan. And the progressive values that we share would be such things as Taiwan is the only country in the region that, like Canada, has same-sex marriage. They are, like Canada, working on reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. They're a leader in women's rights. They're a potential partner on such things as plastic pollution in the oceans and so forth. We have very pragmatic interests in Taiwan. I think everybody's talking about semiconductors these days, but there are much greater economic ties. A lot of Canadian business are active there, very visible are companies like Roots. Northland Power has a big wind project in the Taiwan Strait. And also Taiwan is basically the security linchpin of the Indo-Pacific. If Taiwan were to fall, then I think the repercussions would be really the end of the prosperity that we have known for such a long time, and the lifestyle that we know today. And I think that would be a very serious threat to us. So anyway, basically, I think it's really important here that in this context in which China has a longstanding goal of annexing Taiwan, carried on some very intimidating military exercises around Taiwan in August, has been threatening Canada. We don't want to assume that war is inevitable. I don't think it is. But it's interesting that when they're in this document, it begins in a section about the problems posed by China. It actually warns China in a way by saying, and I quote here, "Respect for the sovereignty of other states is a cornerstone of the rules-based international order." And then there's a lot about Taiwan in here. It mentions Taiwan 7 times, the Taiwan Straits once. Twice it's about collaboration with Indigenous peoples, but it is about other things as well, like the misinformation and so forth. I think I want to point out two things that the strategy, ways in which it kind of frames what we can do in Taiwan and then how we can move forward. First of all, the strategy is very clear by saying that we engage with Taiwan, and I quote, "while remaining consistent with our one China policy," unquote. And I think it's important to point out here that this is Canada's one China policy. This is not the one China principle that Beijing tries to impose on the rest of the world, including Canada. So our one China policy, this is Canada's as a sovereign nation, is that although China may claim Taiwan, Canada just takes notes, and we neither endorse nor challenge that claim. We know that's aspirational. It's not factual. The second thing I wanted to bring up is that Canada will, quote, "continue to grow its economic and people-to-people ties with Taiwan while supporting its resilience," unquote. And so I think we can ask why they chose the word resilience there, and not the word sovereignty, although we We do know that Taiwan or Republic of China is a sovereign state. But resilience is something that kind of dovetails nicely with U.S. policy. The U.S. just passed the Taiwan Enhanced Resilience Act. It's a word being thrown around in international relations quite a bit now. It's an ecological metaphor. It's about an ecology that can withstand unpredictable shocks, such as by protecting your shoreline by building dikes at sea or planting mangroves. So there's a lot we can use to think about that. Resilience is very flexible. It looks for bottom-up solutions to things. And so that's why we can use resilience to think through strategies moving forward. And so that would be things like our friendshoring. We want to have our economic security by guaranteeing our economic ties with Taiwan through a free, for FIPA, Investment Protection Act, by lobbying to get Taiwan into the CPTPP and other things. Also, these indigenous initiatives are very important. Having relations between indigenous nations in Taiwan and Canada, it's a part of that relationship. So there are many things we can do moving forward, and I think that it's a good beginning, and I'm very happy with it.
Well, thanks a lot, Scott. I mean, I think you highlighted the wide spectrum of reasons why we should care about Taiwan. And I think, your point on security, I think, is an important one too. And a point that I think many of us who work on these issues are familiar with. But I mean, Taiwan's security very much is Canada's security. And I think understanding that point that, number one, again, the maps are important and instructive. Look at a map, look at where Taiwan is positioned in the Indo-Pacific. I often refer to it as the strategic spine of the region. With Taiwan, instability over Taiwan means instability in the region, which means instability for our neighbor who has interest in the region, which then means instability for us, in addition to all the other reasons why we should care about Taiwan. So I think making that point clear, I think, is important. I do want to move on now to what I would refer to as the lightning round, and I hope to get two rounds in to get everybody back in for some comments. And very happy with this initial set of comments. I'm going to ask people to be very brief in their responses here, about 60 seconds, so we can try to get 2 rounds in. And I guess the first sort of question that I have for everyone is, I think we talked about the different elements of the strategy. And I think one thing we can agree, whether we have critiques here and there, is that I think it's in all of our interests as Canadians who care about this part of the world that, of course, we want Canada to succeed. I mean, we want Canada to be more engaged in this part of the world. We want Canada to articulate its interests, to follow those interests, to be consistent, to be sustained. I think that regardless of how that plays out, we all share that ideal vision. I guess my question would be, if we can put ourselves into the future, 10 years into the future, it's 2032. What is one thing, if you can pick out one thing why this strategy would have succeeded? So why, in 10 years, if we have a very successful engagement in the Indo-Pacific, what is one reason in your mind? There could be many, but why our approach has actually paid off, and we've actually been able to accrue benefits in this part of the world, and be seen as more serious? And the flip side of that, if you can answer in the same question, is one reason why we failed. 10 years into the future, this strategy becomes a complete flop. What would be a reason that despite our great visionary ideals and aspirations, that this did not work out? So, Margaret, if I can pick on you first, just because it's been a while since we heard you speak, to answer that one.
Sure, great. So I would talk about it in terms of at the end of the 10 years. And my first assistant deputy minister level position was in Department of Finance. So I want to talk about the money. And it goes to Marius Grinius's question about how do we make sure this actually happens, that it gets executed. So the funding is $2.3 billion, but 750 is for 3 years. The balance is 5 years. And then there's an assessment, but it goes out another 10 years. And it's going to ramp up because we're not ready at the full-on price of each year, because we have to ramp up to get to a steady state. That means that the average per year by the end of the 5 years is going to be higher than in the first 2 years. That means the steady state is a higher number, which gives us more capacity. One of my this is going to give us a big presence in the region. And especially if we do some nuances, like maybe move our AIIB money into the big infrastructure FedDev initiative. How we might fail would be if we don't ring fence that money. Elliot made the good point that, we announce initiatives and we do them for a few years and then that all gets canceled and new initiatives are announced. That happens all across the government. It's really frustrating. And I think it's, one government announces something to fanfare, and that belongs to that government. So a new government comes in and wants its own stuff and put its own stamp on it. And that's where we get these fluxes. So I think we need to ring fence the money, and I think we need to ensure the continuity to 10 years and beyond.
That's a great point, Margaret. I think it hits on a lot of things that we've mentioned on the transactional nature of it. I mean, I think a lot of people on this call, myself included, have been advocates of this, appointing some sort of special envoy or some sort of, important figure who could engage with this region on this topic. That being said, the last thing I want is a special envoy that is seen as a project and, we have an issue to deal with. Let's get a special envoy. He can do it for he or she can do it for 5 years. And then Asia, check, time to move on to the next project. This can't be dealt with in that manner. This can't be approached as a special project, but it has to be approached as we talked about before, as a lifelong commitment in order to be serious. If I can, maybe Jeff, if I can move to you on this the same question about the potential successes and failures. And I know it's hard to predict the future, but I'd like to have your points.
Yeah, okay. I certainly appreciate Margaret's comments. I guess I would add, sustained attention by not only the federal government, by provincial governments, because we can't forget that provincial governments have a lot of constitutional given rights over things like resources and the movement of goods within their boundaries. In any case, there needs to be strong coordination. I think we need excellent execution. I mean, it's one thing to have a vision and a set of goals and objectives, but we need a real action plan that dives down into the details, and there are clear objectives, clear timelines, clear measures, and reporting and accountability. We're going to need to see that. Otherwise, there's no way that Canadians are going to know that we're making progress on this. And I think, coming back to the funding issues, the sustained attention, maybe the final thing is, I would say we could fail too if our allies and partners in the region don't take us seriously, because we didn't take our commitment seriously. And that's kind of been the history of our relationship in the Indo-Pacific to date. As somebody said, this is a watershed moment. This is when it's do it or die now. So I totally agree with that. We put our stake in the ground. Now we have to follow through.
Those are some really good points, Jeff. And it strikes me, I mean, one of the discussions that we're having here, and we may not have mentioned it explicitly, but I think we're implicitly mentioning it, is I also think the importance of people who are executing this, people who have the equities, experience, language skills, connections to the region, I think are really, really important. Because one of the things I found, I mean, we have gold mines like Jim Boutillier and others who have been in the region for a long time, but I find a lot of ministers and prime ministers who have traveled over the years, they know they should be there. They know they should go to the APEC meetings. They know they should go to all the ASEAN meetings, but you kind of get a sense that they're doing it just because they know they have to be there. Versus when I see this engagement in Europe, there's a sense of, oh, I like being here, and I feel this is where I should be. I don't know how to frame this in a proper way, but basically, I think with that comfort factor in the Indo-Pacific is clearly not there at a ministerial level. It's clearly not there, sometimes even with our senior officials. We need to build up that cadre of Asia expertise throughout all levels of government. and work with all sort of hands that we have, private sector, civil society. Everyone's going to have to sort of pitch in for this to work. I want to move though over to Charles to get his thoughts on this, and I think frankly a big part of the success or failure is going to be on how we manage China, and maybe that might form some of your comments on potential success and potential failure of this in a 10-year horizon.
I think you're right. It is about China. It's a question of whether China can become a stakeholder in the international rules-based order, which would suggest that there would be domestic changes in China. The current leader is not in a very solid position. We might see some transformation. I'm old enough to have lived in China before reform and opening under the Mao era, and we saw some fairly dramatic changes when the Cultural Revolution was repudiated. But I think that the success would be if we develop a strengthened world order where the institutions of global governance are strengthened and peace prevails. Failure, China may already have won the third world. They can certainly rally more votes on resolutions about the Uyghur genocide than we can and defeat them. And in other areas, they have a lot of support from third world countries. So 10 years from now, if the policy has failed, Taiwan is a province of China, and the United States no longer has troops in Japan and South Korea. And, and Canada's policy, which has always been split, since 1989, with regard to China, between those who believe that we should only focus on promoting Canadian prosperity in our relations with China through trade and investment, and that we shouldn't be concerned about human rights issues as much as it was the big concern in the early 90s, and now security issues, would go back to the "if you can't beat them, join them" school. And that China would have won, and liberal democracy would have lost, and God help us in terms of what the political future for nations domestically would be after that. So I think it is a critical moment, but I don't think that we're seeing the kind of commitment of resources and focus necessary for us to overcome a rising China that is more and more able, hidden in plain sight, to realize its agenda. And I don't think that this policy will just fade away, because China is not fading away. They're continuing to move from strength to strength unless we're able to effectively constrain China's malign destruction of intention of malign destruction of the existing global order, and bring them into a position where they'd like to collaborate with us as opposed to confront. I mean, certainly the statement in the policy that China is an increasingly disruptive global power is pretty mealy-mouthed. I mean, really, China is, a systemic rival or a strategic competitor or a strategic adversary. And I think we have to see things more clearly and ally with like-minded countries to act accordingly.
Well, thanks very much, Charles. I'm going to move over now to Elliot for his thoughts in the crystal ball. And I think, Elliot, you spurred this question a lot with your mention of how transactional Canada's been over the past 20 years, 30 years in the region. So, hopefully we have a better 10-year horizon and we can be more optimistic. But I'd be interested in your views on both how this could go right, how this could go wrong.
Of the globe, which just got alluded to, that's going to affect everything, whether China succeeds in what it wants to do, which is pushing everybody out of the region and making the South China Sea a Chinese lake, and pushing back on Japan and taking over Taiwan and so forth. But underneath that, yes, my broad comment would be the success or failure. Melanie Joly says, I'm coming to the neighborhood when she goes there. It isn't our neighborhood at the moment, I think. So the big broad picture is, are we an Indo-Pacific country in 10 years or are we not? But there's two things I'd like to raise that haven't been touched on yet. One is the demographics of Canada. We're talking about Canada today. 10 years from now, it's even going to be more of an Asian country than it is today. in 1992, I was just reading some census reports. They said the majority of our immigrants are coming from Europe, but that may be changing. It has changed dramatically. If you take a look at the top 5, top 10, we are going to be increasingly de facto and empirically a country with a lot of people who have Asia as their ancestral homelands and a lot of diaspora talent to factor into how we behave in the Asia Pacific. That diaspora talent, human capital, social capital, we haven't talked about it all here, and it doesn't get attention. The second thing you alluded to very briefly, and that's the investment in knowledge, which of course I'm speaking now from a biased perspective. That's my bag. I've spent my entire career saying to my students, but also more broadly in my public role, Asia's coming. Asia's getting organized. Asia is going to be on our horizon. Are we ready or not? I've done my little bit and trained generations of students who actually know where the South China Sea is, for example. But those two elements, I think, we've given up investing in area studies, and we get caught over and over again. Oh, Afghanistan, where's that? And then we spent blood and treasure in Afghanistan, scarcely understanding what it is. We certainly need a much greater investment in knowledge, not only in going back to what governments used to do, having specialized knowledge within their agencies, but more broadly, we need a lot more knowledge in Canada about an emerging, rising, approaching Asia.
Well, thanks, Elliot. That's a great point that I think builds on that the importance of people. And when I'm referencing people, I'm not just picking on a few ministers or prime ministers, but I think you're right. This goes to the universities. This goes to the way we train and recruit public servants. I think we've eschewed subject matter expertise at our peril, and we've put it into a box that is seen as sort of unnecessary. But I think we've realized time and time again, whether this was after 9/11, whether it was after February 24th, and all of a sudden people wanted to know who spoke Russian, who had expertise in Russia. The realities are that these competencies have always been important, and I think that increasingly those in the Indo-Pacific will be more and more important. So I think we need to pay more attention to that in our staffing and in our universities. Kyoko, I'm going to move to you next, and I know it's an unfair question as a newcomer to Canada to ask you about how you think our policy will succeed or fail. But I'm interested in your perspective from the outside on number one, how you view Canada's engagement in this region, and where you hope, hopefully on the success side, it might go.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. I think it depends whether Canada's public diplomacy through the strategy works well or not for 1 decade or 2 decades. Canada could fail if its messages are not consistent for 1 or 2 decades, and its partner misunderstood Canada's message, for instance. In that sense, maybe disinformation issue could be one of the elements for Canada to have successful strategy in 5 years or 10 years. Disinformation threats itself was mentioned actually 3 times in the strategy, and security in the cognitive domain, as I said before, has become one of the most important security areas for all democracies, not just for Canada or Taiwan. And many of its partners, including Japan, want their own partners or allies, I would say, who could fight against disinformation threat together. So it could be important to start discussion on more integrated cooperation in cognitive domain through, for instance, through the framework of the G7. For instance, or maybe in cooperation with countries in the region in the Indo-Pacific, or Canada, Taiwan, Japan, trilateral cooperation could be one option, maybe. Canada's continued interest and consistent messages to its partners in the region are needed if it wants to be, if it want the strategy, make the strategy successful, and otherwise maybe its messages won't be able to attract its partners to fully cooperate in that region.
Thanks very much, Kyoko. Yeah, I think we can all agree that the public diplomacy side is just such an important element. I think one that will is important at this juncture, but I think is going to be important every day of this strategy. I think it's making sure that those discussions and articulating where we want to go in this region has to be a consistent message that's done in multiple capitals all throughout the region. On disinformation, I think that's really neat too. And I mean, one of the things that maybe we haven't used the word itself so much tonight, but I think leadership is a big one. Canada sometimes on these issues, due to our affection for multilateral bodies, we tend not to take the leadership role on a lot of these issues. I think that we need to lead in parts of the Indo-Pacific. We can't lead on everything. We don't have the capabilities to lead on every certain issue, but we can find niches where we can lead. And it strikes me on disinformation, this could be one that we strike out a leadership role, potentially with our Japanese friends, maybe with our Taiwanese friends and others. For example, you saw the Summit of Democracies that the United States held. Why not have a global summit on disinformation? Why not put some investment into that and take a leadership role, encouraging some of our Indo-Pacific partners to take part? Just an idea. But on that, and I know that because she mentioned Taiwan, I'm going to pick on you, Scott, as the second to last before Jim Boutillier takes us home. Scott, what's your sort of your nightmare scenario and your best case scenario in the future for the Indo-Pacific?
Okay, I'll start with my best case scenario because that's the way the questions went. But I think that in the best cases, what just happened in Montreal with this biodiversity conference that was co-hosted with China is perhaps something that is a sign that we can do things with China. And so I think that in a best case scenario, we would have peace. We would have convinced China that peace is also in their best interest, and we'll be able to work with them and partners in Taiwan and South Korea and the Philippines and Japan and so forth on issues that are of common concern. So I think that's really where we should be going if we are successful with this policy, and we show that we are leaders in some areas. I think that in a worst case scenario, however, there are many of my colleagues here have brought up other things, but I think it's important to note that Russia already has a presence in the Arctic, and I think that if there's a conflict, if Taiwan becomes part of China, that our own sovereignty is threatened in the Arctic. I think there's some links there that need to be looked at more, and so I think that there are some serious threats ahead if we do not succeed with this strategy.
All right, thanks, Scott. And Jim, as always, take us home, hopefully on an optimistic note, and don't scare us before we all go to bed. But Jim, the floor is yours.
Jonathan, let me be telegraphic since time is limited. I think that while I entirely agree with Margaret about ring fencing the finances, I think that the amounts of money that have been spoken of are far too small for a project which is as vast and multi-yeared as this one. Secondly, in answer to your earlier question, I think the U.S. Navy would be more than happy, will continue to be happy to have our contribution. A very, very serious debate is unfolding in Washington now about the realities of naval warfare in the Pacific. And we either hang separately or we hang together. And so we'll see that there will be greater and greater pressure for us, in fact, to contribute to the common weal. We need, parenthetically, to think the unthinkable. I think what's happened in the Ukraine has brought home to us, or should have brought home to us, how unpredictable and how lethal international politics can be. Are we ready for any sort of hostilities in the Indo-Pacific region? What does that mean? I think that we must deal, as Scott has suggested, with China moving forward, that climate change looms over us as the vast unspoken monster, regardless of where your affiliations lie in the region. I think we have to set aside our proclivity for premature self-congratulation and stay the course. Urgency, as implied in Jeff's commentary about energy availability and our readiness to deal with energy demands, urgency should be the order of the day. Well, we can do it, and we must do it. As I suggested in a little piece that I'd written recently, we have to create a brand, we have to put in real money, and we have to appear again and again. And when we do so, then I think we will be able to, in fact, be proud of this Indo-Pacific strategy. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Jim, Coco, Scott, Elliot, Jeff, Margaret, Charles, and Stephen, who had to leave us earlier. I mean, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I hope it has also been for our listeners here. I think there's been a lot of interesting takeaways on the Indo-Pacific strategy, but the main takeaway, and I think that the thing that I think all of us will be watching as we're avid followers of this part of the world, is on the action and what happens next. I think there's a lot of things that we can suss out of this document, some positive things, some things we critique, some things that are incomplete. But the reality is that Canada needs to show action, and I think needs to show action in a long-term lens. And I think we all hope that that action does happen, because I think it's in the interests of our country to be more engaged in this part of the world. And we will be following it very closely. And if that action is not followed, we will be calling it out. So please do stay with us. And again, I do thank all of our panelists for taking the time tonight and the morning for Stephen. And we look forward to having you back again.